I want to take a minute to show you some different watercolor techniques for those of you that might be using watercolor at home. I may have shown you these before. I don't remember. But I've also given you a PowerPoint presentation with some of these different techniques kind of listed with some examples as well. And then feel free to stop my video or practice as you need to. These watercolors I don't think have been used in a very long time. All right, so the first technique would be a wash, which is the one that we typically use. It's helpful if you tilt your paper a little bit when you're working with watercolor as well. So I'm going to start by kind of running a bead of color across, and you can see how it pools towards the bottom. And I want to overlap that as I do my next mark making here, trying to get it to be the same tone. And then last but not least, kind of finishing it up here. The goal with a wash is to get it to be flat and even. I have a little bit of variation going on. It's not terrible. If you get a little pool of color at the bottom, you want to dry your brush off, and you can kind of run your brush through that little pool and it will soak up any extra paint that you have there. A graded wash is similar technique, except that we want it to get lighter or darker to change the value. So if I start off with a darker value at the top, as I start to move down, I'm going to add more water into my brush. I'm going to continue to add more water as I also overlap that color. Again, if you get that kind of bead of paint at the bottom here, you can go ahead and suck that up with your brush. Wet and wet, you can start with a kind of a clear water if you want to. This one has a little bit of a tint to it from my paint earlier. And you're going to go ahead and add in some other colors. And you're going to start to get lots of bleeding. You can kind of get some different tie-dye effects this way. And it's very soft edges. Thing with watercolors, we have to be patient and allow it to dry if you don't want the bleeding. If it's still wet, you're going to wind up with the bleeding of colors in between if you're not patient. A lot of times what people working with watercolors will work on multiple pieces at once so that one can dry while they work on another one, and then they can come back to it. So you're working back and forth a lot. Another technique would be water on wet, where we start with a graded wash here. My brush didn't get that color completely here. Let's try that again. And we can go ahead and add in just clean water, and it will give you kind of these different water spots. And when it dries, it has this kind of very soft liquid feeling to it. Kind of a neat effect to get some different variation instead of just having flat areas of color. You could play around with that water and wet. Glaze is one where we need to let it dry in between. So I'm going to go ahead and lay down just one color here, and we're going to come back to that then in a little bit. With dry brush, you want to start with a brush that's completely dried off. You want to add a little bit of paint without trying to saturate your brush too much. And now you can go in and make some different marks that way. This is a neat one to think about layering. You could also think about using different types of brushes in order to get some different effects. These 6 are kind of your basic watercolor techniques. We will go in at the end and go on top of the glaze with another color. The next 6 I want to show you are more experimental here. So our wax resist, you're going to use a crayon. And I like to use the white crayon because this is kind of like magic. If you have little siblings or cousins at home, this is a great one to keep them busy. So when I go over now my mark that I just made with the white crayon, it is revealed. Good for secret messages and things like that. For masking resist, you can use just regular masking tape, but you could also use like a blue painter's tape will also work. This one is wider, so you could even like cut out shapes or different things with an X-Acto knife or scissors. Masking resist is basically this idea that if we put down the masking tape, I think it's a good idea to put the tape on your jeans or your pants first and get some of the lint from your pants on there so it doesn't stick too much. This is great for putting around the edges of your artwork if you want kind of a nice finished hard edge. And then we'll let that dry before we peel up that tape. Indenting, start with your wash or your kind of surface here. I think this one looks better when we have a little bit darker color here. Try and fix that up. And now you want to use something sharp in order to indent the surface of the paper so that the paint will kind of flow into that indent. So the back of the paintbrush works really well. You could use like a toothpick, so you can see how it kind of seeps into that indented area. Salt, start off with your, ooh, that's very dark. Let's see what the effect is. Start off with your wash there and make sure it's pretty watery. And then we want to sprinkle your salt on. And then the salt will absorb different pockets of that paint, and you'll get this kind of like snowflake effect. We'll have to see how that one turns out. Once it's completely dry, you can rub the salt away. Blotting is something that you can do with just a simple tissue. Got salt all over here. Oh, look, there's some nice salt effect as well. And then use your tissue, and you can blot, depending on how tightly you kind of wad up that color. You can get different types of effects that way and textures that way. The last one I want to show you is the plastic wrap. And this is another one that you can get some neat kind of bubble looking effects. Take your piece of plastic wrap. You don't need a lot. And you're going to kind of smush that paint around a little bit. And then you're going to let that dry completely before you remove it. Let's go back up to the glaze. If this is completely dry, now we can go on top with another color and we can overlap. As long as you're not pushing too hard and reactivating that color underneath, you should have a successful glaze. And the idea of glazing is basically like layering. You're layering multiple colors on top of each other, but because the first one was dry, you shouldn't get that same bleeding. So each individual color keeps its hard edge. If your masking resist is dry, you can go ahead and peel that away as well to reveal your nice hard edges. And then when the salt is dry, you can remove the salt, and then when the plastic wrap is dry, you can remove that as well.